It's a pleasure to be back on campus. I haven't been back in many years, so it's been a lot of fun to walk around and see the new buildings and also just see Valpo be the vibrant place it seems to be. So it's really wonderful. So I thought I would start by sort of talking about how I became an immigration lawyer, sort of how I advocate for immigrants now, by actually starting back here when I was at Valpo, and talk first a little bit about how I ended up going towards law and social work, and then talk about how I actually do my advocacy now day to day. So hopefully that will get us started, and then I'll be excited to hear your thoughts and questions as well. So as they mentioned, I was a student at Valpo and a Middle Eastern Studies major, and I spent a lot of time here being very driven academically, being very excited to learn a lot about the world, and very engaged in just sort of answering all of these questions I had about specifically the Middle East, but also just globally what was going on and how I could learn more. I was really excited about that in the classroom. But then I spent a lot of the rest of my time really engaged in a lot of service work through SALT, and just really excited about learning new skills, whether it was organizing skills or fundraising through the World Relief Campaign, or just talking with my peers about what are the best ways to actually change the world in a really positive manner. Spent a lot of time struggling with that particular question. And so I got to my senior year, and as some of you may be experiencing or will experience in the future, had a bit of a crisis of what to do. What was I going to do with my life, especially given that I had all of these academic interests, and I had all of these sort of very active work interests, and I didn't know how to put them together. And for as driven as I was, you'd think those two things would have popped up in my mind at some point earlier on, but for me, it really happened senior year where I began to really struggle with that. And so a couple things happened that year. One is I took my first social work class and saw that there was a lot of language in a particular profession for actually struggling with some of those questions or thinking about those questions. So that was somewhat exciting to me. And then I also thankfully had a really great advisor, Professor Chuck Schaefer, and he put me in his International Service Senior Seminar. And that was very important for a number of reasons. One, because I was forced academically to think through some of these issues on paper. I'll still remember getting that paper back, and he said something like, "This could be a really great idea, but it's not yet." In part because I just wasn't ready. I just hadn't, thought through all of it all yet. And so that was sort of important guidance. But also because he took that group of, I think there were just 6 students, and we went and visited I think some sort of Valpo connection, but someone who was leading, I think it was called Refugee One, which is a giant refugee resettlement center in Chicago. And we learned all about his work, and it suddenly clicked that there might be some place in the United States that you could work with immigrant or refugee international populations and get to engage in all sorts of cross-cultural, interesting issues, but work here and sort of be embedded in the community here. And that really appealed to me. It was also very interesting to find that there were social workers, caseworkers working with those immigrants, and then there were also lawyers. So I sort of began for the next couple of years to sort of sort through what might be the best way for me to advocate on behalf of immigrants if that's what I chose to do. So I went through a very scientific, orderly process of discernment that basically involved not being able to make decisions about what I wanted to do for the next couple of years. I say this because I remember sitting on campus here and often hearing people talk and thinking, oh my goodness, they have such a rich vocational life, they've made all these great choices, and everything that they did seems to sound so good. And you just heard some parts of my resume read, which is very nice, and they read all of the parts that all make sense in the context of me being an immigration attorney. But I promise that there were many parts of my 20s that don't make sense in that beautiful trajectory. And I definitely experienced that in terms of deciding whether or not to go to grad school and what type of grad school to go to. So I ended up not making a decision, and I chose to do both a Master's of Social Work and a JD. Which in many ways, if you think about it for a second, is kind of strange. Social work and law are not necessarily two professions that get along with one another. Sometimes lawyers and social workers are working in diametrically opposed efforts, right? And so you can imagine showing up in law school and saying, well, I also want to do social work, and then being like, really? I mean, okay. And then going into the social work building and saying, yeah, I also want to be a lawyer, and then being like, really? Whose side are you on, right? And all of that was basically, for 3 years, just sort of repeating those sorts of questions for myself as well, trying to figure out, well, who do I want to be? What kind of language, professional language, do I want to use? What professional role do I want to own? And I can't really give any advice for how to deal with that gracefully, because I sort of stumbled along through it. But what I did sort of realize by the end of the program is that I wanted to be an attorney, but I wanted to do it in the context of a social work setting and sort of with a social work mindset. I wanted to be grounded in social work values and always be working with marginalized people, but I wanted to use the language of the law to do my advocacy. And in a way, being involved in 2 professional programs forced me to really articulate that in a really clear way for myself, that perhaps lawyers who don't necessarily have to go through that didn't have to. But it also made for quite a struggle in terms of grad school, and certainly if you're thinking of grad school, I would really encourage you to do some of that discernment prior to actually showing up there. But every once in a while, doing things in a disorderly way kind of works out, and that was my experience. The one thing I didn't really mention is sort of how I really got to wanting to specifically work with immigrants. So I had always had a love of sort of cross-cultural engagement, and certainly, like I mentioned, getting the idea of working with refugees really interested me. But one of the first things I did after leaving Valpo was I started volunteering with a refugee resettlement agency in Indianapolis called the Exodus Refugee Immigration. And they had just started resettling Iraqi refugees after the war. And that was sort of perfect timing for me because I got a chance to work with someone from the Middle East that I had just been studying, but also have a chance to actually engage in the direct work of, okay, well, what happens when you have to show someone who only speaks Arabic, and you speak very little Arabic and only a little English, and you have to show them around a grocery store because they have to be able to buy food. And it was this very direct question of, well, how do we do these substantive day-to-day things, but also getting a chance to sit with them and meet with them and get to know their families and develop these relationships with them. And I really loved that, and I loved all of the cross-cultural questions that came up, and all of the issues around that really excited me and made me feel like, this is the direction I want to go in. And thankfully, throughout grad school, I had a lot of really great internship experiences that confirmed that sort of hunch, that excitement that I had. And so working at places like Catholic Charities, Immigration and Legal Services, where I was basically working with poor immigrants every day, was that the excitement that I felt doing that was confirmed, okay, yeah, this is really a population that I want to continue working with. And so that's how I kind of brought all the things together. Yes, I want to do law. Yes, I want to do social work. But also, I only want to do it with immigrants. This is the population that I feel excited about serving. So that, in sum, is how I decided to become an advocate and sort of chose my vocation along the way. So now I thought I would talk a little bit more about what I actually do now, which is perhaps more exciting than my vocational journey. So I am a staff attorney at the Pennsylvania Immigration Resource Center. PIRC is a small nonprofit, like many nonprofits around the country, that works directly with low-income immigrants. Ours is a little different because we work with a subset of immigrants who are detained. So I want to sort of break that down a little bit just so you have a sense of who I'm talking about. So if you think about the immigration population in the United States overall as like just a giant group, right? And then we're going to split it in half. And one half of people are documented. So who's someone who might be documented? Anyone like shout out? What kind of documents might you have?
I do have a student visa.
Student visa, yeah. So someone who has a student visa or even a visitor's visa. Any kind of visa that allows you to come into the country, often on a short-term standpoint, is someone who's documented. What's the most common one?
Green card.
Exactly, a green card, yeah. So a green card usually is someone who's going to be here a really long time. The technical name is permanent residency, even though it's not actually permanent. It can be taken away. But yes, absolutely. People who have visas and people who have green cards are going to be our documented population. Then on the other side, you have people who are undocumented. And that population actually comprises a lot of different people. So it might be people who come across the border from Mexico and don't have any papers. That's kind of the classic example, right? Something you might see on TV. Someone who is undocumented, never had any papers. But it might also be someone who fell out of status, maybe who had a visitor's visa or a student visa or a work visa, and for whatever reason they lost it, whether they stayed too late or stayed past their time or lost their work visa because their employer no longer cooperated. For whatever reason, they no longer had that status, but they're still in the United States. Okay? That can also include green card holders who have lost their status. So say someone who has got in a fight, maybe got an assault conviction and lost their green card, and so they would no longer have status and be in this country as well. All right? So you've got your documented folks and your undocumented folks. I spend most of my time working with undocumented folks, all right? And most of the agencies that are like mine that work with poor immigrants are working with people who are applying for some sort of status to stay in the United States, or potentially are people who are in removal proceedings, or what we often call deportation proceedings. And that's going to be someone who has to go in front of court, go in front of an immigration judge to determine whether they can stay in the United States. All right? So you've got these two groups of people, and then you got me at a detention center. So a detention center is a little different because not only am I looking at people potentially from both of these categories, people who are undocumented and people who had status in the past and maybe are going to lose it, but you also have people who the government has made a decision that during the course of these proceedings, during the course of court, basically, they need to be detained. All right? And in the United States, we have detention centers all over the country, but immigration also contracts with local facilities, usually local jails or prisons, to hold people there as well. So I work in and out of York County Prison, where about 800 or 900 beds are contracted with immigration for immigrants to stay there. All right? So I'm seeing people in all of these categories. I'm seeing people who have come across the border and are seeking asylum. Maybe literally came up to a Border Patrol officer and said, "Please, sir, help me. I want asylum. I believe in human rights. I was persecuted in my country. Please help me." And the response for the Customs and Border Patrol officer is to detain that person. And then that person can be sent all over the country, including the prison where I work in and out of. So that's one group of people. So they would be considered undocumented because they arrived at the border and had no papers, but specifically our law says that we have to detain those people. I work with people who just generally have been here in the United States for many years, but didn't have documents, and for whatever reason, they get picked up now. And so they get put in detention. My favorite example of this is if, say you're 25 years old and you live in a city and you can't afford your own place, so you're living with 4 roommates. And you don't actually know anything about the immigration issues with your other roommates, you just know that you don't have documents and you're maybe working at a place that pays you under the table. Well, all of a sudden, one morning, ICE shows up, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. ICE shows up and is looking for your roommate. You don't have anything to do with it. You haven't done anything wrong. Maybe your roommate got in a fight, got some sort of conviction, so ICE came to pick them up. And then suddenly you get swept up and everyone in the house is also detained and put in removal proceedings. So people who are undocumented for long periods of time, if you've heard about the fear that many immigrant populations have, it's often because of situations like this, whether it's ICE coming to a home, whether it's a pickup in a car because a taillight is out, or someone being pulled over. But that's the sort of situation that I often see when people are detained who haven't had papers in a long time. And then lastly, there are people who have lost their status for whatever reason. Maybe someone who overstayed their visa, maybe someone who lost their green card because of a crime, and so they also are detained while the government figures out whether or not they have a way to stay in the United States. So now that you've got an overview of Immigration Law 101 and what's going on in terms of immigrants, you can all pat yourselves on the back, feel good about that. So there's all these people, they're all detained in this prison. What do I actually do? So this is sort of an interesting sort of area of immigration work, because the client's not going to come to my office like they would if they were applying for some sort of employment visa, or if they were applying for some sort of, maybe even applying for asylum, but if they were, you know, in a city and they weren't in detention. So I'm always going to them, and I'm doing a couple different things. I might be meeting with them one-on-one to talk, you know, potentially help with an asylum application if they speak a language that no one speaks in the prison. So they speak Tigrinya, or say they speak, oh my goodness, so many languages, Haitian Creole. So there might be some one-on-one assistance, potentially. Sometimes I go in and I do orientation sessions where I talk about the process so that when they get into court, they know what's going to happen. Because unfortunately in immigration, there's no right to counsel. There's no right to what we think of as like a public defender. And so they're either going to represent themselves, or they're going to find the money to pay someone, to pay a lawyer. Sometimes our organization is able to provide direct representation as well, but we have a really small staff, so we're not able to do so much of that that we can offer it to everyone. And then the last piece I do is I actually represent people. So I go into the immigration court and I help people apply for particular types of defenses that we call, that would allow them to defend against deportation and remain in the United States with status. Most of my clients are, so all of the people in detention, I would say, are very vulnerable. It's a very vulnerable subset of immigrants in this country. I tend to work with people who are even more vulnerable within that subset. So people who have mental health issues, people who are what we consider arriving aliens, which are people who come to the border and have no papers and apply for asylum, who often don't speak English, don't speak Spanish, and don't have any resources to actually make that asylum claim in front of the judge. And then I also have a special interest in working with women. So whether it's someone who has experienced domestic violence in the past, or whether it's someone who has just some sort of gender dimension of her claim, whether it's forced marriage, sexual assault, etc. I do have sort of a slight interest in that area as well, in part because of my previous work. So, once I go into the prison and I'm meeting with these people, the sort of questions in my mind about how to go about advocating them for them the best certainly depends on the situation and depends on sort of what's going on with the person. But there are a few things that I have begun to think about as some of the bases for my own advocacy, and I thought I'd go through some of them tonight. So the first is when I enter a room and I know that there's going to be someone in there who likely doesn't speak my language, certainly doesn't share my culture, and likely has experienced horrendous things that I cannot fathom. Where do you sort of begin with that? And the first place I begin is to try to go in with an open mind, and to keep in mind that cross-cultural competence, sort of the touchstone in the field, is something that you constantly need to be thinking about and growing in as you go along. So for me, that means not making assumptions about even basic things, about family structure, about what's going on in their lives, about why certain things happen to them, right? And sometimes that can be hard because assumptions are embedded in just how we think about the world, right? But certainly, cross-culturally, you learn to ask certain questions differently and to try to make it as open as possible so that the person feels that they can trust you and tell you what they need to do. This is especially important because as an attorney, I'm also a storyteller. I'm the one who, most of the time, gets to control how a particular story gets told to a judge, which gives me a lot of power. But you can imagine if I am not cross-culturally competent and I choose not to emphasize a story in a certain way, it can make a huge difference as to whether or not a person's story actually gets told in a way that's authentic, but also potentially in a way that allows them to get relief, allows them to have a defense to deportation. So one sort of very simple thing is, I mentioned sort of thinking about family structure. So marriage, for example, is thought about in very different ways in certain other countries. So for example, right now, if you were a victim of domestic violence, a survivor of domestic violence in your country, and you want to apply for asylum, that might be possible for you to get asylum, but many of the cases, many of the laws, are all embedded about whether someone's married or not. Because that's our very white, sort of Anglo view of what would happen in a family, right? If there's going to be domestic violence, well, of course there's going to be a marriage. No assumptions there at all, of course. Well, you know, some of my clients in the past have been from Central America, where the assumption is not that people would get married. And certainly if you have, if you don't have means to pay for a wedding and to pay for different things that would go into the marriage, then certainly you would not be married. And so there are huge communities, especially in rural areas or areas that are low income, where there's lots of intimate partners, but you wouldn't necessarily see a legal marriage or a spouse. So it's my job, if I'm representing someone who wasn't married, to explain why a relationship where there was domestic violence still should be deemed a marriage under immigration law for the purposes of this person getting asylum. Which all sounds sort of dry, but in terms of asking the client questions, you're asking a lot of questions. Well, how long were you married? Did you have children? What was going on in your marriage? How did you treat one another? And you get into all of these very interesting cultural questions about how people treat one another. They all really need to come out in front of the judge. And so that's my job in terms of being a lawyer, to make sure I ask the right questions. But it all comes back to, if I never asked the question about, well, why weren't you married? If I didn't sort of push back against some of my own assumptions, then we would never even get there. So you want to always, or at least I always try to start with cross-cultural competence as much as I possibly can. But my clients also surprise me all the time, which is a good reminder to always be engaging in that. So that's number one. All right. Number two is empathy. And this is something that I wish we talked more about when I was in law school, in terms of constantly bringing an empathetic presence into one's work. And I think just because there are so many different types of clients that lawyers engage with, that's not necessarily the forefront, at least of the discussion in my law school. But certainly it was something that came across all the time in my social work program, right? How do you go in and talk to someone who has been through so much and not first empathize with what's going on with them, especially in situations when you can't do anything? So even though I'm a lawyer, I spend a lot of my time every week thinking of all the things that I can't do anything about, especially in a system that's as harsh as the immigration system. There are just so many things that I can't move or that I can't change. So bringing empathy with me, with each of my clients, is a really important basis for my advocacy. So I'm going to give an example here. I was meeting with a number of women, I think 4 or 5 women, at a time when they were very frustrated. They were very frustrated to have been detained for 5 months. They were very frustrated that they were in orange jumpsuits. They were very frustrated by the food, by the treatment, by all the guards. They were very frustrated that even though America talks about human rights, they were going to be deported. And they were going to be deported after being treated really badly in their view, and certainly in my view as well. And I was in this discussion knowing that I could do nothing. I could not change anything about this situation. I could not get them out of detention. I could not tell them that there was a way for them not to be deported. I certainly could not change anything about the prison in terms of how they were being treated. And you could tell that's what they wanted, right? They wanted someone to change something. And so in my discussion with them, after they kind of ranted for a little while, I made sure to look at each one of them in their faces, and I said, I am so sorry. I am so sorry that this is happening to you. I wish that I could change something, and I cannot. And then I just listened and sort of talked with them, probably for 15 minutes longer than I normally would have, right? In the end, did that change anything about their experience? No. Were they still deported? Absolutely. But was there one moment where they didn't feel that they were dehumanized? I really hope so. And sometimes that one moment that I can give someone, that one moment of true empathy, sometimes it makes a difference in a case and allows us to start on a trajectory of a relationship of trust that ultimately results in someone not being deported. Sometimes it doesn't. But I think in any of those situations, I find that if I can find the sort of the heart and the effort to really truly empathize with someone, my advocacy is gonna be better for that. Just want to make a quick note. Most of the people that I work with have exhibited some sort of symptoms of PTSD, and certainly have experienced a lot of trauma in the past. PTSD being post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's also particularly important for empathy, given that if you've struggled with a lot, and many people who have been through trauma have not felt that they were humanized in a variety of settings, potentially a lot of court settings, it's even more important for that. And so having a sort of trauma approach to my work, even if it's, with that tool of empathy, is also really important. All right, next, I find that persistence is a very important tool. For any of you who decide to go into work in helping professions, whether it be social work, law, education, anything where you're going to deal with a big beast of an animal that you're going to have to work against in terms of legal requirements, regulations, policies that don't make any sense, things that really push people down and make people feel bad. One of the things that I love about social work is you have a lot of doers. You have a lot of people who are going to make those phone calls 14,000 times for their clients, and they're going to just make stuff happen, right? There's a level of persistence there that I think is unparalleled when it comes to social workers. I'm a little biased, but I like to think that I brought that with me in my journey as an attorney, because I think sometimes attorneys get very frustrated and impatient with that kind of work, and certainly push it onto their paralegals, which I don't have, so I guess I have to do it anyway. But I think that persistence sort of on both sides, whether it's that social work type of persistence or the kind of legal persistence, where you really advocate so strongly for your client that you're not going to give up, that you're going to push back against the judge, you're going to push back against the government, and you're going to make sure your client's argument get heard. Both of these are types of persistence that are just necessary for advocacy. Because if you just sort of get bogged down by everything that the system has to offer, then you're probably going to switch professions pretty quickly. Yeah, so I guess that's sort of the piece with persistence. I find that I tend to be willing to fight for my clients, even in situations where I wouldn't be likely to fight for myself, or even just to sort of engage in different things. For example, though I'm talking to you now, up in front of you, I don't love talking in front of people unless it's really for a client. I'm here today because I care about this program, and this is fun to talk about, right? Like if I'm going to be talking about something, it's going to be this. But outside of this kind of setting, I'd really prefer not to get up and talk in front of people. I'd rather be doing the hard work behind the scenes until you get a client beside me, right? Then, once a client's beside me, you can bet that I'm going to stand up and I'm going to fight on their behalf, right? I'm also going to do all the hard work behind the scenes to make sure that we're prepared that day. So it sort of lends to those strengths. But that persistence can be really important. As well, in terms of making sure you are, or at least making sure that I'm a better lawyer, right? I'm just a few years into my legal career. I still have a lot to learn. And you have to be persistent to want to keep going against the grind and just saying, okay, I'm going to learn this. I'm going to be better. And you know why? Because it's going to be good for the person sitting beside me. So that's a big piece of it as well. All right. Next, we're going to talk about, I told someone earlier, this is like my soapbox. So get ready, get excited. So the next thing for any advocate, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a community organizer, whether you choose some other route, you have to take care of yourself. You have to engage in self-care. In particular with this group, when you work with populations that are so traumatized in the past, anyone engaged in that work is going to be at risk for vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, or various ways of talking about that. There are a lot of terms, but what we're really talking about is if you're going to end up feeling so traumatized by what has happened to your client that you end up burning out over a short period of time, over a long period of time, it's not going to help your client, and it's certainly not going to help you. And so at the base of all your advocacy, framing some sort of plan for self-care and then being willing to reinvent that plan 1,000 times is really important. And this is something that I loved doing the social work program for this very reason, is we were constantly talking about self-care. Because when you're a social worker and you're constantly dealing with human needs, whether you're a therapist or a clinical social worker, you're constantly having someone just push a lot at you. And if you're not prepared for it, if you're not able to really deal with it, then that's not going to be sustainable work for you. Well, lawyers have the same thing happen to them, we just don't talk about it. And there's a huge rate of alcoholism and drug use in the legal profession, and I've often tried to connect the two, and lawyers don't really appreciate that too much. But it's a very significant thing. How do you tell someone who's going to work with primarily marginalized populations who have experienced trauma, okay, here's how you do the legal work, but we're not going to help you know actually how to take care of yourself in a substantive way. That can be really problematic, just from a professional level. Personally, I have found that while I'm far from perfect with self-care, some of the tools I learned in my field work during the social work program have really helped me, and helped me at least be mindful of if I'm sitting with someone and I'm starting to get very impatient with them or feeling frustrated by some of their questions, that probably has nothing to do with them and everything to do with me. And probably me needing to go back to the office and have a little self-care time, right? And even having that sort of base awareness and monitoring one's self-care, I think is really important. And certainly if you're interested in anything social justice related, if you're going to hear stories again and again and again of trauma, of things that are difficult, of fights that are impossible to win, you want to be able to take care of yourself. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that the number of people who sort of start out in this kind of work and then veer off into something else because it doesn't end up feeling sort of emotionally safe to them. So I found self-care to really be an important piece. And I think especially as someone who works with clients who have mental health issues, this is especially important because if I get frustrated with a client that's giving me a hard time, and so then I respond back to them, and then by my response back to them, whether it's frustration or whatever, I end up re-traumatizing them, then I've re-traumatized a traumatized client. Right? And that's just not okay. Just from a social justice perspective, if you're working in a system that's dehumanizing people already, as soon as you become a tool of that dehumanization, something has to be checked. Something has to be reevaluated. And that's hard. I think people experience that a lot, and then many of them do check, kind of check it and work it in a different way, and then some people just have to leave because it's too much. I want to be in this for the long haul. I want to be doing this 20 years from now, and so I'm really trying to engage in certain ways that allow me to do that well, and when I don't, to sort of step back and figure out something else. All right. So lastly, I would say for myself, in terms of being a good advocate for immigrants, in addition to the direct work I do, actually representing someone in court, preparing their cases, being cross-culturally competent in my work with them and preparing their statements and in preparing them to tell their stories, I also need to realize that my work is just one tiny piece of such a huge system. And our immigration system hasn't been developed in a humane way, in a just way, and the changes that have needed to happen have not happened. We may have heard of efforts to try to get comprehensive immigration reform that have continually just fallen apart and fallen apart. And so I need to recognize for myself, or at least I feel that I do, that my work cannot just be about this one client in front of me. And so I need to be a part of broader efforts to try to change the system. So for me, that means showing up to protests. That means calling my legislators. It means being willing to come to talks like this. It means finding any way to sort of take my work and make it slightly bigger so that we can try to really push for systemic change, push for a comprehensive immigration reform plan that actually looks like something real, that sounds like comprehensive immigration reform, as well as push back on changes, policy changes that really harm people. So certainly happy to talk about any sort of political events that have happened recently if people have questions, but certainly the current political environment in terms of being anti-immigrant or having policies that have veered in an anti-immigrant way have certainly affected my work in the sense that we're seeing larger detained populations, which sort of makes my work harder. But also, just even if something's not affecting me directly, for example, I don't work with refugees directly, but that doesn't mean that the refugee ban doesn't affect my work, and it certainly doesn't mean that I should be blind to it. So all of those sort of broader political issues, I think you could find plenty of attorneys who just say, well, I'm doing my work, and I'll do that, and we'll let the policymakers make their changes. I sort of feel like, if nothing else, for my own self-preservation, if you cannot go out into the streets and fight and say, hey, this is happening to my clients and it's not okay, then one, where do you put that rage? Because I certainly have some of that rage that's not enough to just put up on social media, right? You want to get out there and make your voice heard. But also I feel a responsibility to do that as well for my clients, because they are stuck in a prison. They are stuck in a detention center where they cannot leave. They cannot make their voices heard. And certainly many of them are a whole lot more eloquent than I am. And their voices would be, you get them up here, and I think that you would all be moved to tears. But they can't leave, so I have to do something. And for me, that piece of the advocacy is sort of directly intertwined with my own. So you can have those levels of advocacy, the direct and then the more vocal. So, now that I've left us on a really positive note, of our political system. Those are my thoughts on advocacy, on what I do, on sort of where I come from, or where I come at advocacy on a day-to-day basis, and a little bit about the people that I serve. And also, hopefully, a testament to, I don't think there's any direct path in your 20s, even if someone says there is, to going from college to finding something that is a really good mix of their sort of academic interests and their passions and their beliefs. For me, I did find my way there, and I'm so happy to find work that I do feel very committed to and passionate about, and I think is a good mix of both things that fascinate me and excite me, but also is a mix of things that I directly want to do and respond to real human need. And that's really great, and I hope that for all of you who are students and sort of thinking about your own paths, don't commit yourself to needing to figure it out tomorrow or the next couple years. I'm happy to, if you want to come talk to me afterwards, I'll just tell you the list of all the things I did wrong, and you guys can make those changes in your own lives. But I really, I do think it's important to keep working towards that, and I know a lot of people who are very dissatisfied with their work, and I feel happy every day that I found something that, even though it's really hard, and even though there are a lot of struggles, at the end of each week, like I still know why I'm there, and that's really makes me happy. So, that's me.
Anna, thank you so much. We have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions and conversations, so I hope that you will step forward with those. I just want to make a comment while you're thinking about your questions and the conversation that you want to have with Hannah. That the Institute for Leadership and Service thinks about how to help students develop a sense of purpose and direction. Not find a career, but develop a sense of purpose and direction. And one of the reasons that's so important is that research has shown when you have opportunities to really think about your purpose and direction in college, as you get out in life, that persistence, that capacity to keep moving through is so much more developed. And just hearing that in your own journey really brings that to life for me in my own work and helps me feel persistent. So maybe I'll just start off and just ask, so how do you find that persistence? Has it always been there in you? Are there particular moments in your education or your own internal development where you began to see that really fit into place as a key virtue and skill?
Well, I like that you call it a virtue. I'm not sure everyone would call my persistence a virtue exactly. Yeah, so, I mean, I do think I probably am a pretty persistent person just generally, but I think in terms of like being able to operate in systems, right, and be persistent in terms of like my work day to day, or just in terms of goal oriented, like, for example, doing a joint degree with two programs that don't really work together is not really enjoyable by any means, especially when just generally the two professions like don't cooperate. So that was definitely something that's like, well, I have this purpose, I have something that I want, I have this goal, and can I keep pushing for it? And at various points where it doesn't seem worth it, evaluating that, but then continuing to push onward. I don't know exactly where that comes from, but I do think that I got some practice while I was here at Valpo. I was an individualized major. Professor Schaefer back there was like key in like making it possible for me to get that thing through. But you sort of learn to wrangle with requirements, right? And so then I did that again in my grad program, and now instead of academic programs, I wrangle with, you know, immigration law, and I wrangle with the prison, and I wrangle with various government entities. So maybe it's kind of a mix of both. Practice makes perfect. I do think that I'm someone who, like I mentioned before, that I don't mind making the 16 phone calls if it's going to help my client. There are some people that just mind that. I don't really know whether there's a difference in there. So I think that sort of quality you can either probably acquire, or it just kind of comes innately. And for me, it came innately.
I came in late, so I apologize. And I apologize if this has also been answered already. But my question to you, and you just give me a brief summary, just trying to get the scope of things here. Is there something inhumane and unjust about our current naturalization process in the United States?
Current naturalization process?
Yes.
You mean like naturalization for citizenship specifically,
yeah,
or immigration?
Yeah.
So naturalization is the process for someone to become a citizen, just in general, so that everyone's on the same page. Usually you have to be a green card holder for 5 years before you can apply to be a citizen. In certain situations, if you're married to a U.S. citizen, it can be 3 years. In terms of, well, I guess I would say a couple things. There's access issues. The costs are going up and up for people who want to become citizens. I don't actually even know the cost right now because I think everything changed in December. You know, just in terms of poor immigrants' access to citizenship, for sure that's an issue. You know, I think in general there's a lot of discussion about people who have had past criminal offenses, especially if they're very minor, and whether or not they can then apply to get citizenship. That's something that definitely comes up. But is it inhumane? I mean,
Or unethical, or immoral.
Yeah. I think those are the two things that come to mind. I don't know that I would say that they're inhumane. Citizenship is sort of the last stage in such a difficult, inhumane process that it's sort of like saying, you know, is a whole triangle, is the very tip top of a triangle, is it inhumane if everything else before it is inhumane?
Okay.
So I guess that's why I'm hedging. But I think in general, once you get to the citizenship part, you're looking at more privileged folk in general. So, yeah, I'll have to think on that one a little more.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
So you deal with detained people, do you try to get them bond hearings to get them out first and then deal with them in immigration court? And then immigration court, do they bring the detained people there, or is it through a TV?
All good questions. So, sort of back up. Someone who's detained is going to have the opportunity to go and see if they're even eligible for bond. There are some people who are not eligible for bond. I mostly end up working with those folks who are what's called mandatory detention. Those could range from people who have just come across the border, who we call arriving aliens and who have asked for asylum. Those people are all detained in mandatory detention, as well as people who have various criminal offenses. So say you have a substance abuse problem and you got maybe a minor substance abuse issue. You're probably going to be detained for your whole proceedings simply because it was a controlled substance issue. So, but that immediately funnels people in two different directions. Either they're in mandatory detention or they're eligible for bond. So that bond hearing is going to happen pretty early on. My organization doesn't do tons of them because most people who are eligible for bond are going to lawyer up. They're often people who have been here a long time, and they're going to have access to an attorney. Also, people are just so scared right now that they're coming up with money for attorneys, which is good because they're getting counsel, but bad in that there's so much fear that they feel that they have to have counsel at that early stage. But yes, bond is an option. Now, for people who continue on, who are in mandatory detention, the immigration court, at least in my setting, is literally right next to the prison. They just kind of go into the immigration court. Yeah. So most of the time, they're going to see a judge directly in front of them. But televideo hearings do happen as well. So people who get out on bond, they're still going to go to an immigration court, and they're going to show up elsewhere. So like say, if they're from around here, I would assume that they would go to Chicago for the immigration court in Chicago. But there are some courts that they like, so if you're from like Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, there's no court in Pittsburgh. There's only one in Philadelphia. So they do a televideo for people in Pittsburgh, for example. Which is very strange. If you ever want an odd experience, it's going into a small courtroom and having a judge be on a televideo screen and trying to feel like this is actually some sort of work of justice is a little bit far-fetched often. But yeah, that's gonna be their experience. But for the people who I serve, they're gonna actually see a judge directly. Yeah.
So a couple points you talked about the mutual distrust between the social work world and the legal world. So I can guess at why that might be, but I'm curious. Do you think that is inevitable? What would it take for occupants of these two worlds to have a mutual appreciation rather than a mutual animosity?
That's a good question. It's sort of hard to answer because there's so many different facets of social work and law. I mean, they're in many ways, they serve such varied groups, and so you would think that they would have more kinship. But it also makes it hard to answer. So for example, like in the child welfare situations, completely not immigration related, but child welfare situation where you have, a lawyer, like a divorce attorney, trying to negotiate a custody agreement, and you have the social worker, or like in a foster care scenario potentially. All of these involve lawyers who are advocating potentially for parental rights, right? And then a social worker coming in and advocating for a child's rights. Well, how do you do that? Are they constantly going to be at odds? Maybe, maybe not. But that kind of scenario happens in lots of various facets. I think actually in the immigration scenario, it's a little bit less so, simply because social workers and lawyers alongside are really working to get people status. So there's a lot more synergy that happens. I just don't happen to work in a setting where there are social workers as well. But to answer your broader question is whether or not they could get along, I kind of have mixed feelings about it because I think that they have different roles in so many arenas, and those roles are both important, right? You want a social worker to advocate on behalf of whoever the client is, whether it's a child, whether it's an adult, whether it's someone who's mentally incompetent or whatever. I mean, you want that person to do it with passion and gusto, but you also want a lawyer there to make sure people's rights are being safeguarded. And sometimes those are just going to be at odds, those roles. And on the best day, if you have people doing it really well on both sides, then I think it might be okay, right? Because then, in the end, hopefully the decision maker or whatever's going on might actually that allow for a good preservation of both the specific decision, but also someone's rights. I think what really happens often is that you have people who, it's when there are crises and when there are struggles and people aren't able to do their jobs as well as they'd like, especially for financial crunches and all of the agencies that social workers and lawyers tend to find themselves in. And so I think that's where it can be really hard. But I would love for it if it was a little less, animosity sometimes. And most of the time, I make it sound really bad, but a lot of times I run into amazing lawyers who totally appreciate what social workers do and vice versa, right? But every once in a while it does pop up. Questions? Yeah.
Are you noticing any more harshness under the Trump administration than under the Obama administration? Because these immigration issues are not new.
Right.
So are you noticing any more signs of growing harshness in your day-to-day
Sure.
work or
Yeah. So, well, first I just want to echo what you said. These issues are not new, right? And politically, immigration has always been something that I think I said earlier that we've always been at loggerheads over. There's a reason why we haven't seen comprehensive immigration reform, right? It's not just because there's now a Republican in the office of president. So I will also say that, we call Obama, at least in my field, deporter-in-chief. He deported more people than any president before him, and his level of detention just skyrocketed. And so there were a lot of people who were Obama supporters who really found that level of immigration policy to be really problematic, even if he did come up with DACA, right? DACA is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, sort of like a path along to the Dreamer legislation that never happened. And certainly there's been a lot of discussion about DACA that makes it sound a bit more positive, but you also have to take into account that lots and lots of people were deported under Obama. So that being said, there have been a lot of policies that have been widely talked about in terms of the executive orders, in terms of some of the memos that have come down directing the Department of Homeland Security, which is the agency over ICE, to basically execute the laws in different ways, and that has absolutely affected my work. Not in the way like the ban on refugees has affected, which is like a very specific, like this is what's going to happen to these populations. But we're starting to see detention numbers climb. We're starting to see people moved around a lot, which has a lot of effect on people's immigration cases, on their ability to access their families, on just their treatment in these facilities. And, there's more and more discussion of raids, of various things that certainly happened under Obama, but in terms of whether the tone or the policies at the top, whether those are shifting, how are those things are happening. I can't really comment on that, but it's being talked about a lot. I think it's something that advocates and lawyers are really going to be watching in the next couple of years to see, how do these things play out more, and what do some of the early signs, at least in the detention context, what's that going to mean? Mostly, I would say the biggest thing that it's affected is morale and fear. We get a lot of phone calls at my office of people just really scared. And, I think for people who do the work like I do, there's also just a sense of kind of gloom and feeling of, what can we do, especially when, for a while there, when an executive order was coming down, it felt like every 10 days, it was like, oh my gosh, just like, give us a chance to breathe. And I don't think that that's gone away. I think we're all still sort of waiting to see really what's going to happen. And there's been a burst of advocacy and just a lot of excitement within immigration attorney circles, and that's been exceptionally exciting to see for me, because then you feel like you're not alone as a practitioner. But it is hard to shake some of that feeling that there is just sort of a charged anti-immigrant nature, and that's hard.
Well, Hannah, thank you for an extraordinarily inspiring talk. You're clearly somebody who does not waste your resources on what is outside your passion and purpose, and so to see this as part of that is a huge gift to us, as well as the work you do in the world. So Thank you very much.